When Karen showed up at my door screaming that my Wi-Fi signal was too loud, I thought she'd finally lost it. But when the FBI came knocking a week later, asking if I had been deliberately jamming radio frequencies used by the regional airport, I realized she had managed to drag me into something that could shut down half the state. It all started with her standing in my driveway, arms crossed like a mall cop with a grudge, telling me I needed to turn down my router or else she'd fix it herself. I laughed, because who says that? But when my connection began randomly dropping, I started piecing together the nightmare that was about to unfold. Karen had always been the HOA's self-appointed watchdog. She monitored everyone's lawn height, counted how many guests parked on the street, and even measured my Christmas lights with a tape measure once, citing community brightness standards. Her obsession with control wasn't new, but her fixation on my Wi-Fi was. She swore the signal was interfering with her pacemaker, then changed her story and claimed it was frying her cat's brainwaves. None of it made sense, but she was relentless. Every morning, I'd see her glaring at my house like she was trying to burn it down with sheer willpower. At first, I brushed it off. I figured she just needed a new hobby or stronger meds. But then my internet started acting strangely. Entire devices would disconnect for minutes at a time, as if someone was deliberately blocking the signal. I logged into my router's diagnostics and saw a strange interference spike. They weren't the kind of noise you'd get from microwaves or baby monitors. These were structured bursts like somebody had set up their own jammer. My stomach dropped when I thought of Karen's garage. She was always tinkering in there with second-hand gadgets from yard sales. I decided to test my theory. I set up a Wi-Fi analyzer app on my phone, walked around the neighborhood, and sure enough, the interference got stronger every time I passed Karen's driveway. She wasn't just bluffing about fixing it herself, she had actually bought or built some kind of signal jammer. The sheer stupidity of it would have been funny if it weren't borderline illegal. Still, I didn't want to escalate things right away. So I knocked on her door, keeping my voice calm, and asked if she had installed anything that might be affecting the neighborhood's Wi-Fi. Karen's response was classic. She smirked and said, "Maybe if you people followed the HOA rules, I wouldn't have to take matters into my own hands." Then she slammed the door in my face. That's when I realized this wasn't just about her being petty. This was about power. She actually thought she had the right to police the airwaves. I was halfway tempted to call the police right then, but I hesitated. If she was really using a jammer, that was federal territory. Did I really want to get dragged into something that could involve the FCC or worse? I didn't have to decide, because the problem escalated on its own. A few days later, I came home to flashing lights up the street. Karen was outside, ranting to a couple of uniformed officers, pointing at my house like she was reporting a murder. Curious neighbors were gathering, whispering. I caught bits of Karen's story. She claimed I was running illegal broadcasting equipment and disrupting aviation signals. I almost laughed until one of the officers turned to me and asked if they could step inside. They explained that there had been a report of interference with the airport's control tower, and they were obligated to check if it was coming from residential equipment in the area. That's when it hit me like a brick. Karen's little science project in her garage wasn't just messing with my Netflix, it was potentially screwing with airplanes. The thought made my chest tighten. This wasn't petty HOA drama anymore, this was life or death dangerous. I told the officers flat out that I wasn't jamming anything and even offered to let them inspect my router. One of them walked through my living room, tested the signal, and confirmed my setup was clean. But as soon as he stepped outside, the interference spiked again. The officer's radio crackled with static, and both men exchanged worried looks. They walked straight over to Karen's garage. She tried to block them, yelling about her rights, but the moment they flipped open the door, I saw it, a clunky mess of wires, antennas, and a blinking power supply that looked like it had been cobbled together from a ham radio kit and a microwave oven. Karen screamed that it was just a harmless experiment, but the officers didn't look amused. They radioed for backup, and within minutes, more vehicles arrived. When I overheard one of them mention FCC enforcement, I knew Karen had stepped into a storm she couldn't weasel out of. The craziest part? Karen still didn't back down. She stood in her driveway, hands on her hips, lecturing federal agents about how it was her duty to protect the neighborhood from rogue Wi-Fi. Meanwhile, I was standing there with my arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold like it was the best reality show I'd never paid for. And even though the situation was spiraling out of control, a part of me couldn't help but wonder just how deep the hole Karen was digging for herself would go. That night, as the agents carted off her equipment in black cases, I thought it was over. But I couldn't have been more wrong. That was only the beginning of a mess so big that by the end of it, Karen wouldn't just be fighting me, she'd be fighting the entire federal government. And for once, I wasn't the one who had to play the long game. Karen was doing it to herself, one entitled tantrum at a time. The morning after the FCC agents carted off Karen's homemade jammer, the neighborhood felt strangely calm. For the first time in weeks, my Wi-Fi ran flawlessly, like a stream of cold water after a drought. I thought maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. I even let myself relax enough to stream a movie without the creeping dread of sudden buffering. But in true Karen fashion, peace was just the setup for something far worse. By lunchtime, the gossip mill was already churning. I overheard two neighbors whispering near the mailbox that Karen had been framed. According to her, the government had seized her science project under false pretenses, all because I was jealous of her technical ingenuity. The absurdity of that claim would have been funny if it hadn't gained traction. By evening, I found a photocopied flyer stuffed in my mailbox, stapled to telephone poles, even taped to the HOA bulletin board. In bold letters it read, "Dangerous neighbor exposed, protect our community." Beneath it was a blurry photo of me walking my dog, with text accusing me of running an illegal transmitter that endangered flights and children alike. I laughed at first, but the humor drained when I realized people were actually taking her seriously. A couple of parents pulled their kids closer as I walked past. One neighbor who had always waved at me now gave me a cold stare. Karen had flipped the narrative, painting herself as the heroic whistleblower and me as the villain. That was her gift, not intelligence but shameless confidence. And the HOA, always hungry for drama, was eating it up. I might have ignored the smear campaign if not for what happened the following day. The local news ran a short segment about radio interference near the regional airport. They didn't name names, but the report mentioned a residential neighborhood being investigated. My phone buzzed with texts from coworkers. "Dude, is this about you?" My boss half-jokingly asked if Homeland Security was going to raid the office. I brushed it off with sarcasm, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Because here's the thing. Right around the time of that broadcast, my Wi-Fi dropped again. I pulled up my analyzer app, and there it was. The same spiky interference pattern I had seen before, but worse, stronger, broader, more reckless. My first thought was denial. Maybe some other gadget was acting up. But when I walked toward Karen's end of the street, the spikes went through the roof. My chest tightened. Either she had built another jammer overnight, or she had something even nastier. And this time, it wasn't just glitching Netflix. The proof came the next morning in the most surreal way possible. I was pouring coffee when I heard the roar of jets overhead, not unusual since we lived under a flight path, but this time it was followed by silence. No hum, no steady traffic, just an eerie void. Within the hour, the news announced a temporary ground stop at the regional airport due to unexplained radio interference. My hands went cold. Karen's garage science project had just shut down commercial aviation. By mid-afternoon, federal vans rolled into the neighborhood. They weren't just police or FCC this time. They had logos from the FAA, DHS, and even TSA. Men in plain clothes hauled out antenna rigs and directional scanners, sweeping the streets like ghost hunters. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Kids whispered about spies. And right on cue, Karen emerged from her house in a pastel tracksuit, clutching a clipboard, acting like she was running the operation. She actually tried to direct the agents toward my property, claiming she had documented evidence of my supposed transmitter. The agents humored her for all of 30 seconds before their equipment pinged in the opposite direction. The signal was strong, chaotic, and unmistakably centered around Karen's home. I couldn't help myself. I leaned on my fence and called out, "Guess your cat's brainwaves are acting up again, Karen." She shot me a look that could have curdled milk, but the color drained from her face when one of the vans parked directly in her driveway. Still, she didn't back down. In fact, she doubled down. She shouted that it was all a setup, that I had rigged her garage with equipment to frame her, and that the HOA needed to seize my property immediately. And unbelievably, a couple of board members actually showed up, clipboards in hand, nodding along like any of this made sense. It would have been comical if the stakes weren't so high. Planes were literally grounded, passengers stranded, and millions of dollars lost by the hour, all because of Karen's crusade against my Wi-Fi. I decided then and there that I couldn't just sit back and let the circus play out. If Karen wanted to weaponize paranoia, I'd counter with cold, undeniable proof. That night, after the feds packed up for the evening, I set up a small SDR scanner in my living room window, a basic radio receiver that could log interference over time. Every spike, every pattern, every burst of chaos from Karen's garage, I saved with timestamp. And sure enough, just before midnight, the data lit up like fireworks. The next morning, as agents returned with even larger trucks and a few grim-looking men in suits, I handed one of them a thumb drive with the logged interference. He studied the graphs, raised an eyebrow, and asked where I got it. "Just a hobbyist setup," I said with a shrug. He nodded, thanked me, and walked straight to Karen's house with a new level of determination. Minutes later, they were hauling boxes out of her attic, equipment she hadn't even revealed during the first raid. This wasn't just backyard tinkering anymore. Someone had supplied her with professional-grade gear. And as I watched her scream and flail while the agents dismantled her experiments, a question lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. Where had she gotten it? Karen didn't have the brains to build that stuff, and she definitely didn't have the money. Which meant she wasn't acting alone. That realization sent a chill through me. Because if Karen wasn't the mastermind, then the real storm was still ahead, and I had no idea how deep it went. The day after the FAA hauled boxes out of Karen's attic, I woke to find 3 SUVs parked along the street. Not the kind with neighborhood watch stickers either. These had tinted windows, government plates, and men in suits lingering nearby with the kind of posture that screamed surveillance. I peered through my blinds, sipping burnt coffee, and wondered how far down the rabbit hole Karen had dragged us. She had always been dangerous in her small, petty ways, but this was national-level chaos, and I was stuck in the middle like the unwilling star of a reality show no one asked to watch. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing. Kids on bikes circled the SUVs, daring each other to get close. Retirees posted up on porches with binoculars. And Karen? She strutted up and down the street in oversized sunglasses and a floppy hat like she was the star witness in a mob trial. Every few minutes she'd march toward one of the agents, wave her clipboard, and start ranting about how I was the true criminal mastermind. Her voice carried so loudly that I could hear every ridiculous accusation from inside my kitchen. According to her, I had been running a covert transmitter for years, laundering signals through underground fiber tunnels, and even controlling airport scheduling software. If it weren't so reckless, it might have been comedy gold. What unsettled me, though, was how the agents didn't immediately dismiss her. They didn't laugh in her face. They didn't even roll their eyes. They just listened politely, scribbled in their notebooks, and moved on. That was when I realized I wasn't just dealing with Karen anymore. Bureaucracies don't care about neighborhood feud. They care about plausible deniability. And thanks to Karen's unhinged performance, I suddenly looked like someone worth investigating. That suspicion became real when, later that afternoon, a pair of men in dark suits knocked on my door. They flashed badges too quickly for me to catch the full details, but the acronyms were enough: DHS and FAA. Their questions were pointed, clinical, and just accusatory enough to make my stomach knot. Had I ever operated radio equipment outside FCC regulations? Did I own or repair drones? Was I aware that my router sat on the same frequency band as certain aviation control backups? I answered calmly, evenly, sticking to the truth but coating it with a sarcastic edge. Yeah, my biggest crime is streaming bad sitcoms in high definition. Lock me up. They didn't laugh. They just wrote. When they finally left, Karen was standing at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed, smirking like she had already won. I gave her a slow wave, as if I had all the time in the world, but inside my chest my pulse thudded like a war drum. Because she wasn't just playing the neighborhood villain anymore, she was successfully weaponizing federal paranoia. And if she could convince even one investigator that I was guilty, my life could implode. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house felt like boots on my porch. At 3 a.m., my Wi-Fi spiked with interference again. This time it was stronger, nastier, like someone had poured gasoline on the flames. I grabbed my scanner logs and followed the signal trail. It didn't just point at Karen's garage. It swung wider, toward the greenbelt behind our neighborhood. My pulse quickened. Was she hiding equipment somewhere else now? Or worse, was someone helping her set up repeaters? I decided to test the theory in the most reckless way possible. I walked into the greenbelt at night with a flashlight and my analyzer app glowing on my phone. The deeper I went, the stronger the spikes got. Finally, tucked under a camo tarp near the creek, I found it. A makeshift rig of car batteries, antennas, and a cheap generator, humming like a swarm of bees. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just Karen tinkering in her garage. Someone had built her a second jammer out here, hidden from sight. The smart move would have been to walk away, call the authorities, and let them handle it. But adrenaline and anger clouded my judgment. I yanked the cables, killed the generator, and snapped a few photos with my phone before covering it back up. By the time I got home, though, headlights swept across my driveway. One of the SUVs was idling, engine humming. I froze. Did they see me? Was this a trap? But after a tense minute, the car rolled on, disappearing around the corner. I exhaled so hard it hurt. The next morning, news broke that a cargo flight had been forced to divert because of radio anomalies during approach. The implication was chilling. Karen's hidden rig had nearly caused a disaster, and because I had tampered with it, I was technically now part of the crime scene. My thumb drive of data suddenly felt less like a shield and more like a noose. Sure enough, the agents came back, this time with sharper questions. One even mentioned the phrase material witness, which sounded way too close to suspect for my liking. Karen, of course, was in full performance mode. She staged a press conference on her lawn, shrieking to anyone within earshot that I had a bunker full of servers under my property. She even held up a hand-drawn map of my house, complete with imaginary tunnels. Neighbors gasped. Some even believed her. I knew I had to flip the script fast. So that night, instead of sleeping, I drafted a dossier. Photos of the Greenbelt rig. Data logs showing the interference patterns tied to Karen's address. Screenshots of her flyers accusing me of running underground fiber tunnels. It was absurd, thorough, and undeniable. And the next morning, when the agents returned, I handed it over with the calm smile of a man who knew the truth was finally too heavy to ignore. Their expressions shifted as they scrolled through the photos. One muttered something about outside assistance. Another mentioned the word prosecution. For the first time, their suspicion wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed past me, toward Karen and whoever was backing her. Karen must have sensed the shift too, because that evening she came pounding on my door, screaming like a banshee. "You think you've won? You think you can frame me?" Her face was blotchy red, hair frizzing out of its bun like a storm cloud. I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, letting her rant. And when she finally ran out of breath, I simply said, "Karen, you're not smart enough to pull this off alone. So who's helping you?" The way her eyes flickered, just for a second, was all the confirmation I needed. She wasn't alone. And that meant the worst was yet to come. The following morning began with the unmistakable sound of helicopters. At first I thought it was just routine traffic. Our neighborhood sat under a flight path, after all, but the rhythm was different. Lower. Hungrier. I stepped onto my porch with a mug of coffee and watched two military-looking choppers circle slowly over the greenbelt. My stomach sank. Whatever Karen had gotten herself tangled in, it wasn't just HOA politics or the FCC anymore. This was national security territory, and I was standing at ground zero. By noon the street looked like a crime scene. Black SUVs lined the curbs, agents in windbreakers lugged heavy cases of equipment, and portable antennas sprouted from lawns like alien plants. Neighbors gawked from behind curtains while Karen, never one to miss a spotlight, stood in her driveway giving a breathless press conference to anyone willing to listen. She ranted about rogue signals, underground networks, and of course me. At one point she waved a printed photo of me mowing my lawn as supposed proof of my communications bunker. The absurdity would have been funny if half the block didn't look like they were buying it. The agents weren't laughing. They moved methodically, scanning every frequency band, comparing logs, and mapping signal strength. I overheard snippets, terms like Class C interference and civil aviation risk. One man muttered that the anomalies were too sophisticated to be some random hobbyist. Another said they were triangulating multiple sources. My heart clenched. Multiple sources meant Karen wasn't just tinkering alone. She had help, and possibly equipment planted in places no one had found yet. That evening, two agents knocked on my door again. Their tone was more measured this time, less accusatory. They asked if I'd be willing to accompany them on a walkthrough of the neighborhood to show where I'd picked up interference spikes. I agreed, partly because I had nothing to hide, and partly because I wanted them to see for themselves just how reckless Karen had become. So I led them down the street, past Karen's ever-glaring eyes, and into the greenbelt. We didn't have to look hard. The camo tarp I'd found earlier was gone, but the ground still bore the marks of dragged equipment. One agent crouched, running his fingers through the dirt. He nodded grimly, then whispered something into his radio. Moments later, the hum of helicopters grew louder. The whole area was sealed off. And then, for the first time, I saw Karen lose her composure. She stormed into the greenbelt shrieking that it was all a government setup, waving her clipboard like a sword. The agents ignored her, but her frantic energy betrayed something. She wasn't just desperate, she was scared. Back at home, I couldn't shake the look in her eyes. Karen loved control, attention, and drama, but fear? That was new. And it confirmed my suspicion. Someone else was involved. Someone she couldn't control as easily as she controlled the HOA. Whoever they were, they had given her enough firepower to knock an airport offline, and now that the feds were circling closer, she was realizing she'd been nothing more than a pawn. The next few days were chaos. The airport issued rolling delays. Airlines complained on the evening news. Politicians demanded accountability. And right there, in the middle of it, my neighborhood became the punchline to every late-night talk show joke about suburban warfare. I couldn't step outside without someone snapping a photo or asking for a quote. One reporter even shoved a microphone in my face while I was taking out the trash, asking if I was the man behind the Wi-Fi wars. I answered with a straight face, "My only war is with buffering." It aired that night, complete with dramatic music. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She started hosting HOA emergency meetings on her lawn, complete with folding chairs and a megaphone. She declared herself the community safety director, and warned everyone to stay vigilant against rogue signals. At one point she accused me of planting radio worms in people's smart TVs. Another time she claimed the helicopters were surveilling her personally because she was too powerful to silence. And the terrifying thing? A handful of neighbors believed her. Fear makes people gullible, and Karen knew how to exploit it. But the tide began to shift when one of the hidden rigs exploded. It happened late at night, a muffled boom from the far edge of the greenbelt followed by a fireball that lit up the sky. I watched from my porch as flames licked the treetops and sirens wailed in the distance. By the time firefighters contained it, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just petty sabotage, it was dangerous, criminal, and deadly. And when investigators confirmed the blast had come from another jammer, the federal presence tripled overnight. The next morning, agents swarmed Karen's property. They tore through her garage, her attic, even her backyard shed. She screamed about constitutional rights and domestic terrorism hoaxes, but they ignored her. When they rolled out a massive crate covered in black tarp, the whole neighborhood gasped. It was the kind of equipment you'd expect in a military lab, not a suburban cul-de-sac. One neighbor muttered, "Where the hell did she get that?" I had the same question, and the answer scared me more than anything else. That night, unable to sleep, I scrolled through my data logs again. Patterns emerged. Bursts timed to coincide with specific flight schedules, interference shaped to target control frequencies. This wasn't amateur chaos. This was deliberate, tactical, and precise. Someone had fed Karen just enough information to let her play Queen Bee, while they used her as cover for something far more sinister. And she was too blinded by her need for control to realize she'd been set up. The final straw came when agents showed up at my door, not to interrogate me, but to warn me. They said Karen had named me in every debrief, painted me as the mastermind, and even filed a formal HOA complaint accusing me of espionage. They reassured me they weren't buying it, but they cautioned me to be careful. Because if Karen's handlers were still out there, they might try to shift the heat onto me next. I thanked them, closed the door, and leaned against it, my heart hammering. For weeks I'd been playing defense, swatting down Karen's lies and dodging her insanity. But now I realized something crystal clear. The only way out of this wasn't to wait for the government to clean up the mess. It was to expose Karen's backers myself. I stared out the window at her house across the street, lit up like a fortress with motion sensors and security cameras she'd probably installed to keep her imaginary empire safe. And I thought, not for the first time, how absurd it all was. One woman's hatred of my Wi-Fi had spiraled into federal raids, grounded flights, and military-grade equipment detonating in the woods. But behind the absurdity lay something sharp and dangerous. Because if Karen was the distraction, then whoever had armed her was the real story. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I was about to be the only person stubborn enough to chase it down. The neighborhood never returned to normal. By the time Chapter 5 of this saga began, our quiet suburban street looked like the set of a spy thriller. The helicopters came and went. Black vans rotated like clockwork. Agents in plain clothes jogged past with antennas disguised as backpacks. The airport had resumed operations, but only under heavy restrictions, and every news channel was still running segments about the mystery jammers. And there was Karen, somehow still strutting around like she was the hero, while the rest of us tiptoed through a war zone. The HOA had split into factions. Half believed Karen was some kind of misunderstood patriot. The other half wanted her stripped of her board position and banned from meetings. Me? I kept quiet. I'd learned the hard way that feeding Karen attention only gave her oxygen. But while I played the calm, sarcastic neighbor on the surface, inside I was gnawed by the same question that had been haunting me since I found that camo tarp in the woods. Who was backing her? The breakthrough came one sleepless night. I was reviewing my scanner logs again, eyes burning, when I noticed something odd. The interference bursts weren't random, they were sequenced. Not just timed to flights, but arranged in a repeating cycle, almost like a coded signature. Buried in the noise was a pattern that looked eerily similar to old amateur radio call signs. That was when it hit me. Karen hadn't built any of this. Someone in the ham radio underworld, or worse, someone with technical clearance, was feeding her rigs and instructions. The next morning, I tested a hunch. I filed a bogus service request through the HOA portal, tagging Karen as the contact person. Within hours, my scanner lit up with bursts that matched the same signature. She wasn't just fumbling around, she was signaling someone. I followed the signal strength across the greenbelt and into the industrial park on the other side of the highway. There, tucked behind a storage facility, I found what looked like a delivery van plastered with fake plumbing company decals. My analyzer screamed the moment I walked past it. Whoever was inside was running the real show. It was reckless to get closer, but curiosity outweighed fear. Through the windshield I glimpsed racks of equipment. Radios, laptops, antennas mounted inside like the cockpit of a submarine. And in the driver's seat? A man I didn't recognize, hunched over a console. He wasn't from our neighborhood, and he definitely wasn't HOA material. My pulse hammered. This was the ghost behind Karen's curtain. I backed away before he spotted me, but my mind was already racing. If I called the feds right away, Karen would spin it as another frame job. If I stayed quiet, the van could vanish, and the trail would go cold. That's when the long game part of me kicked in. I didn't need to expose the van immediately, I needed proof. Rock-solid, undeniable proof. So I started watching. Every evening after dark, the van would park in a different spot, never the same place twice. Each time, Karen's garage lights would flicker on, and her signal bursts would follow. She was their puppet, and she didn't even realize how replaceable she was. I logged every location, every burst, every time stamp. Slowly, the dossier grew. But Karen wasn't blind. She noticed me watching. One night she marched across the street, clipboard in hand, eyes wild. She accused me of stalking her, of plotting sabotage, of communicating with the enemy. I told her flatly, "Karen, you are the enemy. And the scary part is, you don't even know who you're working for." For the first time in weeks, she didn't have a comeback. She just froze, blinking, as if I'd hit a nerve. Then she hissed, "You'll regret this," and stormed off. 2 days later, my house was searched again. Not by the HOA, but by the feds. They claimed it was routine, but I knew Karen had gotten into their ears again. They tore through my router, my basement, even my car, but of course found nothing. When they left, one agent lingered behind and whispered, "If you've got something, now's the time to share it." His eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of trust there. I handed him the drive with my van logs. He tucked it into his jacket without a word. The fallout came faster than I expected. That very night, sirens screamed through the neighborhood, louder than ever before. Agents swarmed the industrial park, boxed in the fake plumbing van, and dragged out 2 men in handcuffs. Karen came running into the street, screeching that they had the wrong people. But when they wheeled out racks of high-powered radio jammers from the van, even her staunchest supporters went silent. The next morning, the headlines shifted. Domestic interference ring busted. Suburban airport sabotage linked to rogue operators. They didn't name Karen outright, but the implication was clear. And the cherry on top? The FCC filed formal charges against her for possession of illegal equipment, obstruction of a federal investigation, and reckless endangerment. The day they came to arrest her, she didn't go quietly. She stood in her driveway in pajamas, screaming about conspiracies and witch hunts as agents cuffed her wrists. Neighbors filmed it on their phones. Within hours, the clips were viral. Karen, the self-proclaimed community safety director, being stuffed into the back of a federal van while still demanding that my Wi-Fi be turned off. I watched it all from my porch, arms folded, the same calm smirk I'd worn through every interrogation, every smear campaign, every absurd accusation. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, it was relief. Relief that the storm she'd summoned had finally devoured her instead of me. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood limped back toward normal. The helicopters left. The SUVs stopped circling. Flights resumed without interruption. but the scars lingered. Kids still whispered about the Wi-Fi wars. Neighbors still eyed me cautiously, as if I might sprout antennas out of my head at any moment. And the HOA? They issued a memo banning all experimental electronic equipment from garages, as if that would solve anything. As for me, I went back to streaming bad sitcoms, running my router like the law-abiding citizen I'd always been. But every now and then, late at night, I'd glance at my scanner logs, because one detail never left me. In those bursts from the van before the arrests, there was a second pattern hidden beneath the noise. A smaller, sharper sequence. Not Karen's. Not the arrested men's. Something else. Something offshore. I never told the feds about that part. Maybe I should have. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe Karen wasn't just a pawn in some domestic game. Maybe she was the accidental face of something bigger, scarier, and far from over. But that's the long game, isn't it? Sometimes you win not by shouting the loudest, but by knowing when to hold a card close to your chest. And if the day comes when those patterns light up again, I'll be ready. Because if there's one thing I've learned from surviving Karen, it's this. The world can burn down around you, but if you keep your head, keep your receipts, and keep your sarcasm sharp, you can outlast even the wildest entitled storm. And so I did.